Next, we open the Illinois Channel archives for an encore presentation of our interview with Holocaust survivor Eva Schloss. As a child, Schloss was a playmate of Anne Frank, and in 1944, Schloss, like Frank, was captured by the Germans and sent to a concentration camp. She shares her story of her family before World War II, how they tried to avoid being captured when the Nazis came to power, and finally, what happened to the rest of her family after they were sent to a concentration camp. This runs about 50 minutes.
Please welcome Terry Martin.
Thank you, David. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for allowing us to be here today on what is really a very special program. I used as a shorthand for telling people what I was going to be doing today as far as this interview. I said, you're all more or less familiar with the story of Anne Frank, but what if you could have talked to Anne Frank? What if she had lived and could have told us beyond the diary what had happened to her when she went to the camp? How did she survive? And how did she adjust to life afterwards? That, in fact, is the story of our guest today, Eva Schloss, who knew Anne Frank, whose lives paralleled, and Eva has her own story. I only use Anne Frank as a reference point since we've all seen the movie. But Eva has a story that I think resounds through the decades and for the decades to come, for those who will watch and hear her story in the decades and centuries to come via what we will do today. And we thank her for being able to share her story. Let me introduce, if I might, Eva Schloss. Ladies and gentlemen, we start Eva's story when she was born on May 11 and grew up and had a wonderful life to begin with in Austria. And I wonder if we might, Eva, if I might have you just read from Barb Power's book, who is with us today, The Promise. This is the first paragraph of the introduction, which I think just sets up how nice her life was prior to the Nazis taking over.
As I look back more than 60 years to the early part of my life, the pictures in my memory are crystal clear. Many reveal happy faces, my family gathered around the supper table, my friends in a game around us, and the summer's afternoon. My father in the mountains, my brother Heinz with a paintbrush in his hands, and grandfather at the piano with me on his lap. I can see flowers in our garden, presents on my birthday, and new shoes for my growing feet. I hear laughter, wonderful music, and my mother's comforting words.
And you had, Eva, so your father was Eric, and he ran a shoe manufacturing or shoe sales. Your brother Heinz, who was, as you noted there, an accomplished painter. And we will show some of those paintings in the course of our program when we televise this. And your mother, who was a wonderful woman, and actually life was pretty good in Austria.
Yes, before the war, before Hitler came in, we were well off. We had a wonderful family, many aunts and uncles, and an extended family. So I grew up there as a Jewish family, but not really religious. And we didn't feel any anti-Semitism, so it was dormant, of course.
One of the things I was going to say that your family enjoyed doing, your father would like to take you hiking in the mountains.
Yes, he was one of the first people who had a car. He came home one day and said to my mother, look out of the window, and there was this funny little vehicle standing, and immediately went up into the mountains on dangerous bends. My mother screaming, you know, because people were not used and the roads were not that good. But so, you know, I remember all this with sadness, really, because it all came to an end.
You write, though, at one point, I believe you were in the mountains and you saw the Edelweiss flower, and your father, what did your father, advice did you give as you were hiking?
Well, he said, climb up there, and you can get this very precious flower because it only grows really where a lot of rocks are, and it's difficult to get, and you shouldn't really pick them, but we did pick one.
And as you were tiring as a young girl, he told you that the goal, that how should you climb and not focus on the angle?
Yes, never look down, always look up, and you'll be able to reach the top. And this is what I've been doing all my life.
And I think those words came back to you many times in years to come, wasn't it? I mean, it was almost as if the struggles that came, your father's advice.
Sustained me, definitely sustained me.
And then in March of 1938, they had what they called the Anschluss. What was the Anschluss?
That was when Hitler's army marched into Austria. There was no fighting. The Austrian people welcomed Hitler. Everywhere from the windows, flags with a swastika was displayed. And of course not in Jewish homes. And people were really happy to become part of this wonderful German Reich, which Hitler promised was going to conquer first the whole of Europe and later even become the most powerful state in the whole world.
And of course they had been in the 30s, there had been a horrible depression across the world, and they were thinking that in part that they were going to have economic redevelopment, or their economy would improve.
That's right. This is what happened in Germany. Hitler promised things were going to get better, and it did get better. He was the first one who built Autobahn, the motorways. So Germany was the first country who had that. And as well, he promised everybody to have a car. The Beetle, the Volkswagen means car for the people. And he delivered that. And that's why people went along. And Austria was going to have the same thing.
But eventually, or maybe not too long, attitudes began to change. The people who you had known and were neighbors and people that worked, how did the attitudes of the Austrians and those surrounding you begin to change?
Well, it didn't take very long. Immediately, the dormant anti-Semitism came out, and people immediately lost their businesses. In Germany, it was a long process. It took many years, but in Austria, it happened immediately. So in the next few months already, we were attacked physically, beaten up. Our houses were smashed, windows were smashed in, Jewish shops were boycotted, and life became really immediately very, very dangerous and difficult to sustain anymore.
And then one day your brother Heinz, who again was just a pretty sensitive young man, a great painter, pianist, could play Rhapsody in Blue, which is one of my favorite pieces, and a pretty difficult piece.
I know.
But he was beaten up, is that right?
He was beaten up, yes, by, in his own school, by his own friends, and the teachers just looked on and didn't interfere. This was a policy. It was, you know, from the government down, it was a good thing to hurt Jews and damage them in any way possible.
What was going on in your mind then?
I couldn't understand, you know. I was just 9 years old, and I couldn't understand the sudden change, the attitude of my family's friends, my own friends, who had been friends since we were very little children. Suddenly, I was not welcome anymore in their homes, and as Jews, we were boycotted, and it was very difficult for me to understand that. And my parents explained to me, as Jewish people, life is going to be really very, very difficult. And as they said, we were going to try to leave the country as soon as possible.
And then eventually, too, your father's business began to suffer because people were no longer doing business with him.
Yes, it just didn't pay him anymore. So, you know, he just couldn't function anymore.
So then, after about 2 years of this, in February of 1940, you moved to Amsterdam, is that right?
Well, we left actually Austria at the end of 1938 First my father went to Holland, and then when we wanted to follow, we didn't get a permit to settle in Holland, so we went instead to Belgium. Again, the Belgian government didn't give us a visa, but we had to go illegally over the border. And once you were there, you were able to stay. And then after the war had been already declared in 1939, after Hitler had invaded Czechoslovakia and tried to conquer Poland, and England and France declared war, then my father tried, well, he had tried all the time actually, he tried to get a visa for us to be able to live in Holland as well. And eventually in February 1940, he was successful. We got a visiting permit to stay for 3 months in Amsterdam.
Your grandfather immigrated to England. Why didn't your family go to England?
My father had no business contact in England, and you know, to make a living, to keep a family alive, you had to have an income. And this is one of the reasons why there were several Jewish people in Germany and Austria who didn't have the courage to leave the country, because they thought, how can I make a living in a foreign country where we don't speak the language, we haven't got connections, and people, you were not allowed to take anything out of Germany or Austria. No money, no belongings, and so it was very difficult. So in Holland, my father had business connections, so, and we thought, our parents thought, that even if Holland Germans start to conquer the world, that Holland will be kept out of the war like it was in the First World War.
And we might say, we all look through the prism of what we know eventually happened, but when the war began in September of '39, when Hitler went into Poland, and England and France then declared war on Germany, their view, and probably everyone's view, was that of the First World War, where the Allies were successful in keeping the Germans at bay for years. No one expected the collapse of France in 6 weeks and for all these countries to be overrun. No. When that happened then in roughly about May of 1940, what happened then to your family?
Well, Holland was invaded. There was only a very short war, 5 days, and the German armies marched in as well. They were not welcomed like it was in Austria. But anyway, you know, the Dutch didn't have a big army, they couldn't fight Hitler. And so Holland was occupied like later Belgium and later France and Norway. So Hitler really started to occupy already a great part of Europe, and the measures against Jewish people were put into place very soon after occupation. So there were quite a number of Dutch Nazis, but from Austria, Seyss-Inquart, which was a Nazi, he came to be the leader of the occupation army, and he was a very, very wicked person.
I should say, just to jump back in time a little bit, one of the people that you met then when you moved to Holland was the Frank family, and since many people and school children watching this have read the Diary of Anne Frank, who eventually became your stepsister, but that was after the war. But you played with Anne Frank as a child. Just tell us a little bit of what you recall of her.
Yes, we moved to a square in Amsterdam called the Merwedeplein, and that was sort of a triangle with many apartments on both sides, and the Frank family lived on one side, and we lived on the other side. And what was customary at the time in Holland, after school, all the children went out to play with each other. And that is how I met Anne, who was the same age as me, 11 years old at the time. If she had lived, she would be now, like me, 79 years old. She was just 1 month younger than me. And we became friends. And of course, many people ask me, how was she? Tell me more about her. But of course, she was at that time, you know, just one of my playmates. But we were not best friends because I was a wild child, a tomboy. I had a brother. We played games, wild games, tricks on the bicycle and things like that. And Anne was more a little sophisticated girl, a real girl with veins. She was interested in her hairstyles and in clothes. And, but she was a leader. You could see that already. She always had a group of people sitting around her, and she always decided what they were going to do, if they were going to go. There was a local ice parlor. We were going to go to this oasis, it was called, or we were going to go to the movies or things like that. So she was a leader, but I certainly didn't suspect that she would be capable to write such a wonderful book like she did in hiding.
Well, and as many of us have seen and heard from her diary, her family went into hiding. Your family, tell us about how your family came to go into hiding and about what you had to experience during that period.
At the same time, in July 1942, many Jewish teenagers, sort of between the age of 16 and 25, got a call-up notice to be deported to Germany. And many parents didn't know what to do, and so they did send their youngsters, but they were all killed in Mauthausen. Only after the war did we hear about that. But the Frank family and my father had decided if a danger would come up one day, we would go into hiding. So we didn't, as children, we didn't know. Our parents protected us as much as possible of bad news. But once this call-up notice came, Heinz didn't want to go, of course, and my parents decided they wouldn't send him, luckily, and we would go into hiding. Hiding meant that you had to have connection with resistance people. By that time, in 42, in Holland, there was a big organization, the resistance, who blew up trains, blew up bridges, killed particularly dangerous Nazis, printed ration books, because nobody would take you in hiding without a ration book. There was very little food, even on the books, but without that, you couldn't sustain another family. So they printed that. Later, they did raids on the offices where those books were kept, and so we were able to go into hiding with connections which the resistance recommended. So those were all people who hated the Germans. The Germans were the enemies, but they were really the heroes. They were the people who risked their own life to help innocent people, mainly Jewish people, but as well later people from the resistance, or young German men who were picked up from the street, who were sent to Germany to work in factories, who didn't want to go, so they went. So
they were slave labor.
Slave labor. They went as well into hiding later. People from the resistance who were identified went into hiding. So many people were in hiding all over Holland.
When you were in hiding, what kind of space did you have to live in? And I believe you said you had to stay very still during the day.
Yes, for 2 years we were in hiding. And if you've ever been in Holland, you know, people don't live in houses, they live in apartments, which were usually quite small. And I must say, rich people who had houses usually didn't help. It was usually the working people who put us up, and they had small accommodation. So we were lucky if we had our own room. And while the people who went out to work, we were not allowed to move. We were sitting down at the table. We had prepared our lunch meal. We had a potty next to us, but because we couldn't walk, because the floorboards might creak, and people downstairs might hear. There are people upstairs. They might not necessarily know that there are Jewish people hiding, but perhaps they're burglars, so they might call the police. So we had to sit still really the whole day.
And this went on for 2 years. Can you imagine a young,
13,
very athletic
14.
young girl, I mean, sitting still for a year, day after day?
As only company, my mother, we got on very, very well. I had a wonderful relationship with my mother, but nevertheless, you know, our conversation was soon, well, you know, what do you talk for 2 years? And I was at that time, I didn't like reading, I didn't like writing, so, you know, I didn't really know what to do with myself.
It was like being a prisoner.
It was.
And then, in fact, on 2 occasions, you and your mother were hiding, and because your father thought that your family's chances of survival, plus the space was so limited, he had split the family up where Heinz and him had gone off somewhere else. But on 2 occasions, you were able to join up.
Yes.
And on one of these occasions, while you and your mother were gone, didn't the Nazis actually come into the place where you were staying and did a search?
Oh, they came all the time. At night, their trucks came in front of doors because they knew Jewish people were missing from their homes. When they went to arrest them, they were not there. And so they were searching for those people. And they just knocked on doors. People had to open doors. You know, there was no freedom for people. I mean, can you imagine that in your own home, police would come and knock on your door and you had to let them in to do house search? But this is what you had to do. You had to open your door to those Nazis, and they did house searches. So in most hiding places where we were, the resistance came, looked over the apartment, and found a place where they could build a false partition, or perhaps under floorboards there might have been a space, or a cupboard which they could camouflage so that it wouldn't be seen. And at night, when this happened, very often we had to quickly go into this secret place and hope that they wouldn't search and find us.
So you were there for 2 years, from 1942 to 1944, hiding. And then on your 15th birthday, May 11, 1944, tell us what happened.
We were just sitting down to breakfast. We had just changed hiding place. We were there perhaps several days only. And I was knocking on the door, and it was early in the morning, so we didn't really, the people didn't expect there would be a house search because, as I say, it usually happened at night. So we were a bit frightened, but anyway, they opened the door and Nazis stormed in and arrested us. They knew, so we didn't wear a stars. They didn't know we were Jews, we thought. And my mother said, we are not Jewish, we are just visiting. But we had been betrayed through a Dutch nurse who my father and brother had just changed hiding places as well, and it was this Dutch nurse who took them to this safe house, but she was a double agent, and she betrayed them. And we had been in touch with my father and brother the day before, so they knew where we were, and all 4 of us were arrested.
You're processed and they send you off to the camps, and tell us just the transport there. You're traveling on a train for about 3 days,
yes.
So packed in that you couldn't even sit down.
It was not ordinary trains, it was cattle trucks, which means like goods train with just a little opening, with a little bit of air. It was May, those trains were metal, and the air in it was just suffocating, and not enough space, and just we got 2 buckets, one which we could use for toilets, and the other one was with drinking water. And once a day, those were exchanged. Bread was thrown in, like feeding wild animals. And like this, we traveled for 3 days, not knowing where we were going to go. But Holland is, of course, in Europe, the most Western country, so obviously we were going east, and that was bad, because we knew about concentration camps and death camps which were in Germany and Poland. We knew that through the BBC. The BBC broadcasts, I think twice a week, to all the occupied countries. So in Holland there were Dutch broadcasts, and I remember it very, very clearly. You were not supposed to listen to foreign broadcasts, but nevertheless, while in hiding, the people wanted to hear good news, uplifting news, because the Germans only told about the battles they were winning, how well the war was going. By 44, of course, it wasn't going so well anymore. The invasion was planned already, and the war in Africa had been lost. So we heard all this from the BBC, but as well, they always warned about the death camps in Germany and Poland, where people were being gassed.
When you were traveling, just as you got off after these days then of transport, your mother asked you to wear her coat and a hat, and then the door opens and you get off, and you see a man standing there wearing white gloves and a baton. Who did you later find out that person was?
That was Dr. Mengele. He was called, as a nickname, the Angel of Death, because he decided who was going to die and who was going to live.
And what did he do with the baton?
He was the one who selected people at arrival. We had to stand in rows of 5 and march forward. It was not just him standing. Behind him were many SS with machine guns pointing at us, and Alsatian dogs on their leashes, which we could see were ready to jump at us. So we marched in front of Mengele, and like a conductor with a little baton, he looked us over, and then he said this side and then this side. At that time, of course, we didn't know what the different sides meant, but we realized that all the young people and elderly people was perhaps 50, 45, depending on how you looked, and young was around 15, 16, and I was just 15, but through wearing the hat which my mother had given me, which had a rim, he didn't really see my face.
He thought you were older.
Yes.
And it's one of the few, there was a series of things that frankly, it's a miracle you're sitting here today. That was one of them.
Right.
That you were not separated with the other young people.
It certainly was. So many mothers who entered the camp had lost their daughters already in the beginning.
Tell us a bit then about life in the camps.
Well, the first thing after this first election, we were herded in. Everything had to go very quickly. And we were herded into a huge barrack where administration was taking place. We were all tattooed. We were written in books with our name, where we had come from, and so on, with our number. And we were told, you are not a human being anymore, you have no name. If ever we want you, you're being called out by your number. Then all our hair was shaved, and that took many, many hours. And while all this was going on, again, it was extremely hot. We didn't have had any water to drink. There were some people who had fainted, and they told us, don't faint, because if you faint, you're going to be killed immediately. Well, how can you not faint on command? So we kind of propped those people up between us. And while all this was going on, which took many, many hours, the capos, those were the people who did the tattooing and the writing in books, and those were prisoners themselves, mainly Polish people who had been put into camps already at an early stage, very often criminals out of prisons, murderers as well, and they had become, I would say, just as cruel and nasty as the Nazis were. And they told us with much pleasure that, you know, the family you've been separated from, you know what has happened to them? They were told to go into a shower, and so people were very happy to get a wash, and they were given a towel and a bar of soap, and they were taken into a shower room. It was a low building with pipes going and shower heads, and people waited for water to come out. And nothing happened. And they started to have breathing difficulties, they started to feel faint, and within a few minutes, people fell to the ground, and within, again, another few minutes, everybody had been suffocated and was dead. And the Germans looked through, there were little peepholes on the roof, they looked when nobody was standing anymore, the doors were opened, and other inmates had to take away their dead bodies, and they were taken to the crematorium to be burned. And this was the first welcome. This is what we were being told. And they say, when you go out, you can smell. And we had this terrible smell the whole time in our nostrils, the burning of flesh. And they said, if you see the smoke, this is your family already.
Your father and brother were separated from you, and you would see them periodically. Your mother, at one point, was also taken away, and you thought she was dead.
My brother I never ever saw again. My father just again by luck, because while I'm sitting here, I must say there was a lot of luck. You know, little instances like that I saw my father and knowing that he was still alive was of course a big boost for me. But one day, after having gone through a shower, we came out naked again. Again, Mengele stood there. I saw him many times, and a selection was taking place. And so naked, we had to parade in front of him. And when I passed, I was going to one side. When my mother followed me, she was taken with about other 40 women of our group at the time to the other side. Those 40 women were marched outside, all naked, and put into another barrack, which was called the death block. And there they waited to be taken to the gas chambers.
No.
Through a miracle, she was saved. But I didn't know this. And only after 3 months, we were reunited again.
How is it that you did not give up in those 3 months when, for all you knew, your father and brother had been killed and you thought your mother was dead?
Yes. Well, again, a miracle happened while I was working one day, and a couple came and said, you are wanted outside. And I thought, well, that's it. You know, somebody wants me to be killed. And very reluctantly, I went outside, and there stood an SS man with my father in a striped uniform, a striped hat with, I could see his shaved head underneath that. And it was a miracle. Until this day, and of course never ever will I find out how it was possible for my father, first of all, to be able to get permission to come to the women's camp, and as well to find me with all those tens of thousands of people, with all the different parts of the camp. And he came 2-3 times. He was a very attractive man. He told me that my brother was still all right at that time. And he went to the kitchen. You know, he was quite amazing. And he spoke to one of the inmates there and asked her to, he said his daughter is here, to give me a little bit of extra food from time to time. And he told me where I had to go and who I had to ask for, and I was able to do that. And again, this helped me to survive a little bit longer. But as well, unfortunately, when my father asked me, where is your mother, where's my wife, I had to tell him that she had been gassed, which I thought had happened. And I think this is why eventually he gave up, because my brother probably died first. He probably didn't think I could have survived so long on my own. His wife was dead, and I don't think he wanted to live anymore by himself.
And your father, will jump ahead a little bit, just we could certainly talk much longer, but the thing is, you find out your mother did survive. She had a cousin, Minnie, who was a nurse who actually worked with Dr. Mengele, and so she had, I guess, the ability to intervene on both your mother and your behalf, because at one point, in fact, you and she were both sick and in a hospital, and then when the Russians were approaching, the Nazis took all the prisoners and took them, which I had been unfamiliar with, took them on a death march, which is how your father and brother eventually died, but the fact that you were left for dead back at the camp saved your life.
That's right. About 300 women who were sort of in a barrack where people were mainly too ill to. By that time, it was relaxed already more in the camp. The crematorium in October, they dynamited the crematorium. There was no gassing anymore because they knew the Russians were approaching and they didn't want to leave any signs behind. So you can still see the ruins are there in Auschwitz, in Birkenau. And those people who were left behind, nobody really wanted to stay behind because they were marching us out, because the rumor had been spread that when the Germans were going to leave, they were going to lock up the barracks, it was all wood, and burn the whole camp down. and nobody, of course, wanted to be burned alive. But somehow, my mother and me didn't go on this march. We would never have survived that. Only later, of course, they were called the death marches. Tens of thousands of people perished. And one morning we woke up, and it was very, very quiet, and the Germans had left. And so you could call this liberation, but it wasn't really, because nothing had happened, and we didn't know where we're going to survive, what was going to happen, where the Germans going to come back, where they're going to burn down the camp, what would the Poles do who lived around the camp, where the Russians coming, were they going to kill us? We had no idea.
So you still didn't feel relaxed?
Not at all. No, we were still very scared.
I'm sure our audience is going to want to leave a little time to have them ask some questions, but what then unfortunately you find out, that was in January of 1945. You don't hear anything about what became of your father and brother until that summer, I believe, and then your mother is informed by the Red Cross that your brother, Heinz, had died in April of 1945 from exhaustion during the walk or march, and your father died May 4th, 1945, one day before the camp that he had been in was liberated.
By the American army. It was the Americans who liberated Mauthausen, a camp in Austria.
And 3 days later, the war ended. It must be very bitter that he came so close after such suffering to be free.
This was for me the hardest of all my suffering. You know, of my suffering I could overcome, but the loss of my family, that is something, you know, you just can never get over.
Before Heinz died, he told you that when he was in hiding with his father, they had done some paintings, and that he told you where they were hidden, and eventually you found them when you went back to Holland. Is that right?
Well, we were on the journey on the cattle trucks. Heinz told me they hid the paintings, 30 paintings, which they had created in hiding under the floorboards of their last hiding place. And so after the war, my mother and me went back there. We were a bit afraid because the lady who lived there was the one who blackmailed my father and brother for more money, and that is why they wanted to leave there and were taken by this Dutch nurse into a trap, and it was really through her action that we were found and deported. So we were a bit scared to confront her, but luckily she had moved out and other people were living there. And indeed, we did find those paintings under the floorboard. And
how many were there altogether?
30 paintings. And 2 years ago, because I thought what will happen when I'm not here anymore, I donated them to the Resistance Museum in Amsterdam, which is a wonderful museum. And they displayed the work with lots of pictures and history of what has happened.
Let me, if I might ask at this point, we'll leave some time. If anyone in the audience wants to ask a question, I think there might have been a microphone there. Does anyone have a question that they want to ask? Yes, sir, over there.
The story needs to...
Could you ask one? She'll bring a microphone for you.
This is a story that obviously needs to be kept on being told, lest we forget, because there's some people in the world today that don't believe this happened. And, but I do have a personal question and a note. I have a friend, an acquaintance of mine in California that you may know that spent some time at the same camp, Rose Torn. Do you know Rose? She also has written a couple of books on her experience, and I got to know her quite personally, read her books, and a very similar story and just different perspective. And I thank you for coming and sharing with us.
Thank you, sir.
While we wait, if anyone else has a question, one of the questions that someone asked me was, did you lose your faith in God while you were in the camp?
Yes, I thought this question might come up because it's very important, of course. And I must admit, while we were in the camp, we prayed. We begged God to interfere, to stop those terrible, terrible happening going on and on and on. And there was no answer. God didn't interfere, didn't help. And so the next question, perhaps God is not all-powerful. Perhaps God is not a good God. We didn't find an answer. The only answer, conclusion we came to, there can't be a God. So many people, including my mother and me, came out of the camp atheists, not being believers anymore. There were some very religious people who came out still believing, but I must say we had lost our faith. But I don't want to let you think that this is how I am now. After a slowly, very, very slow process, I was able to shed my hate, my suspicion, my not being able to trust anybody. And I got married, and the birth of my first daughter in 1956, I thought this was a miracle. After having gone through this, after having been badly damaged mentally and physically, that I was able to create again a human being, perfect, beautiful, to continue the chain, the circle of Judaism and humanity. And as well, I love nature, and when I come out in now wonderful time here in Chicago to see the trees and the blossom after nature had been dead, and as well our own bodies, how everything functions, how we can overcome damage to the body. I said, you know, there must be more to it than just being born and dying. And I do see now God in everything around us.
Is there another question from the audience? Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me, if I might then, Eva, we thank you for telling your story. I know it's important, and it was years before you were able to tell it yourself. There's a quote I'll share with everyone here just to wrap this up. I saw this the other night from Henry Fonda in the Oxbow incident. You might, let me, if I might, before that. Yes, sir, I'm sorry.
When you were confined, were you confined with, were there gypsies there and other Christians? It was not what was their reaction? The people that were, say, gypsies that were also put in, what sort of a accusation did they make against them?
What are you asking? What kind of accusation was made against the gypsies that they were in the camp?
Yes.
Yes, there were gypsies, there were homosexuals, there were Jehovah's Witnesses, there were communists, all kinds of different groups. And on our striped uniforms, we had little triangles with different color. Jewish were yellow, communists were red, black was something else, and so on. So one did know what different groups we belonged to. And against the gypsies was just that it was a race which the Germans didn't value enough to let them live. Because the Germans really, the Nazis really wanted an Aryan people, blonde and blue-eyed and healthy, disabled people. All the German disabled people were killed as well in Germany.
I know one thing you were also asked, so let me ask that. Have you forgiven the German people? Have you forgiven those who put you into the camps?
I haven't forgiven the perpetrators, and I don't want to forgive. Once somebody said to me, I will pray for you that you can forgive. And I said to him, don't waste your time. I don't want to forgive, because those were not what I consider human beings. And, but I have no prejudice or quarrel or bad feeling against the German people in general, or the Austrians, because we have moved on. We have two new generations of people who have met in many, many places in Germany itself, in Austria. They are very, very sorry what has happened. Sometimes they feel guilty, and I said, well, you don't have to feel guilty. You can be upset of what had happened, but you don't have a guilt feeling. And because otherwise, if we would prejudice against the whole people, we would do the same mistake as Hitler has done. And this is one of the purposes I speak out, is so that we can stop prejudices and racism and discrimination against people who are not the same as us.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I promise we'll try to, we could talk for hours more and go into more detail, but I know all of you have to get back to your offices, and we thank you for joining us. Again, I wanted to share you just, I thought it was appropriate, something that came from the Oxbow incident, of all things, a movie where Henry Fonda says at one point, there can't be any such thing as civilization unless people have a conscience. Because if people touch God anywhere, where is it except through their conscience? And what is anyone's conscience except a little bit of the conscience of all men who have ever lived? Eva Schloss, you've shared with us some insights that have touched our conscience, and we thank you for doing that. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for hosting us.
Thank you. Well done. Well done. Thank you.
Terry, thank you for a wonderful job and the questions that you asked. And Eva, thank you for taking the time to be here. We have a small memento of your visit and hope that you'll keep that on your desk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here today, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.
You get everything in?
Well, I think I could have gone on for hours long, but I think in the time we had, it was good. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Carol Harris. Castile Coffee is proud to have sponsored the special broadcast of Eva Schloss's story. Through special arrangement with the Illinois Channel, we will carry this program as a video stream on our website so that it may be viewed at any time in its entirety. We hope you will share this special program with many others so they too will hear Eva's story. If you would like more information about the story of Eva Schloss and her family during the Holocaust, here are 2 books you may wish to read. The Promise by Barb and Eva's Story. Thank you again for watching.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. If you have any comments or questions on our programming, please email us at illinoischannel@aol.com. Or if you have any questions about the Illinois Channel, please visit our website at www.illinoischannel.org.